And in economic winning, President Trump has secured another historic trade deal with South Korea. And so South Korea will invest $350 billion in the U.S. purchase, $100 billion in LNG and other energy, completely open trade with no tariffs on American goods.
Japan gave us $550 billion. South Korea gave us $350. That's $900 billion into a national security and economic partner, fund, if you will, managed by Donald Trump, where America gets 90% of the profits. And these guys bought down their tariff.
When Donald Trump bragged that America had forced allies to pour money into U.S. projects, he didn't just mention Japan. He added another number. Japan, that's $550 billion. South Korea's $350 billion. That's up front. It sounded like a victory speech. But in Seoul, it landed like an alarm. Because here's what actually happened, before we get to what it means. What really happened? It's about the $350 billion squeeze. In July 2025, Washington and Seoul reached what Trump called a handshake deal. The idea was simple on the surface. The U.S. would cut Trump's own tariffs on South Korean exports from 25% down to 15%. In return, South Korea would commit $350 billion in investment toward U.S. projects, energy, infrastructure, manufacturing. Listen to President Trump confirm it.
You have to understand, they've all signed. Japan, South Korea. South Korea, $350 billion up front. Japan, $650 billion. And they've all agreed to it. They're all happy.
On paper, this looked like a copy of the Japan framework. Big number. Big promise. Big headlines. But there was a catch. Trump started talking about that $350 billion as if it would arrive up front. Real cash. Fast. South Korean officials knew immediately that was impossible without detonating their own economy. South Korea's foreign exchange reserves are around the low $400 billion range. Dumping most of that into a single political deal, in a lump sum, would risk a full-blown financial crisis, something President Lee Jae-myung himself flagged in interviews. So Seoul pushed back. In late September 2025, South Korea's National Security Advisor Wi Sung-lak went on television and said it plainly. According to Reuters, he warned that what Trump was talking about was not realistic. He was quoted saying, "We are not able to pay $350 billion in cash." That sentence wasn't a negotiating trick. It was a statement of economic survival. Seoul told Washington, the $350 billion could be structured over time. It would be loans, guarantees, and equity, not a giant cash transfer. And critically, South Korea wanted to keep control over how its money was deployed. Behind closed doors, talks started to stall. Reuters later described the negotiations as at a deadlock over who controlled the funds and how they would be dispersed. Trump kept repeating the upfront line. Seoul kept repeating a different reality. Oh. And this fight over who controls South Korean capital came on top of something else. Trump had already used tariffs as leverage. In his first term, he imposed global steel tariffs, then exempted South Korea, but only in exchange for a hard quota that capped Korean steel exports at about 70% of their previous level. He had pushed to revise the Chorus Free Trade Agreement, which Seoul agreed to under pressure, extending U.S. truck tariffs and making concessions on autos and steel. On security, Trump demanded South Korea multiply its contribution to hosting U.S. troops to around $5 billion a year, more than 5 times what it had been paying, roughly $1 billion. In other words, the $350 billion demand wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was another layer in a long-running pattern. Tariffs, threats, and troop costs used as bargaining chips to squeeze more money and concessions out of an ally. By 2025, South Korea had already seen this movie once. This time, it decided to edit the script. It invented the Seoul countermove, how to say no without leaving the alliance. On the surface, South Korea looks like the perfect target for pressure. Its economy is highly dependent on exports. The US is one of its biggest markets. Around 28,000 US troops are stationed on its soil. It lives under constant threat from North Korea's missiles. In that situation, most people would assume Seoul has no choice. They'll eventually pay whatever Washington wants. They were wrong. South Korea didn't slam the door. It did something more sophisticated. You can call it the Seoul Countermove, 3 tools used together. 1. Time. Instead of accepting or rejecting the deal outright, Seoul slowed it down. Officials signaled that any framework would need to be finalized later, around the APEC summit South Korea is hosting. They framed this as careful negotiation, not defiance, but the effect was clear. No upfront check, no instant win. Time is leverage. Every month that passed without a final deal put pressure back on Washington too. US businesses wanted clarity. Markets hated uncertainty. Trump wanted a victory to announce. Seoul understood that delay can be a form of resistance. 2. Structure. Next, they targeted how the money would move. Instead of a giant upfront payment, South Korea framed the $350 billion as loans, loan guarantees, and equity investments over time. That turns a political tribute into something else entirely, from tribute to portfolio, from cash surrender to conditional investment. And that difference matters. Loans and guarantees can be phased, targeted to sectors that also benefit Korea's own firms, slowed or redirected if conditions change. It's the opposite of wiring a lump sum and hoping for mercy. 3. Law. Finally, Seoul used legal commitments it already had. In security talks, Trump again pushed South Korea to pay more for the US troop presence. But Seoul pointed to the 5-year special measures agreement negotiated under the previous US administration, which set its contribution and locked it in with an agreed increase of about 14%. So, when Trump publicly complained and hinted at new tariffs on South Korean imports, Seoul's foreign ministry simply reiterated, South Korea would follow previously agreed terms on defense cost sharing. That is a quiet way of saying, we have a contract. We're honoring it. If you want to change it, you'll have to break your own word. So they used time. Structure and law as a strategy. Together they form the Seoul Countermove, stay inside the alliance but refuse to be shaken down. Let's see how Seoul prepared to absorb the hit. Of course, this only works if you can survive the pressure. South Korea didn't just negotiate. It armored its economy. In early 2025, as Trump returned to the White House promising new tariffs, Seoul announced record export financing support, around 360 trillion won, nearly $250 billion in loans, guarantees, and insurance to help Korean firms weather US trade shocks. Later that year, when new US tariffs threatened sectors like semiconductors and autos, the government rolled out an expanded package for chips alone, around 33 trillion won, about $23 billion, in support for advanced semiconductor investment, plus additional aid for car makers hit by US duties. This is important. While Trump used tariffs to extract leverage, South Korea used industrial policy and state finance to absorb the blow. They weren't just saying no, they were building the capacity to survive that no. Then it looks like from Tokyo Playbook to Seoul Countermove. In our previous episode, we talked about the Tokyo Playbook, integrated defense. Sovereign economics. We'll train with you. We'll coordinate with you. But you don't control our wallet. Seoul's version is slightly different, shaped by geography and threat. It cannot afford to ever look weak toward North Korea. It deeply needs US deterrence. It has powerful export champions, Samsung, Hyundai, SK Hynix, that live in global markets. So the Seoul Countermove looks like this. On defense, reassure. Keep exercises, keep troops, reaffirm existing cost-sharing deals. On economics, resist. Stretch timelines, restructure payments, insist on shared control over any big investment packages. On industry, reinforce. Use state banks and subsidies to harden key sectors before tariffs fully bite. Allies, yes, but not hostages. Why does this matter beyond Korea? If you zoom out, Seoul's behavior fits a pattern we're seeing from many mid-sized powers. The old assumption in Washington was, If you rely on us for security, we can dictate your economic choices. What Japan did with JBIC and what South Korea is doing with export financing, structured investments, and legal agreements says something different. We will stand with you on defense, but we will not give you a blank check on our economy. And here's the part that should make other capitals pay attention, especially in the global south. South Korea isn't defying the United States from a position of comfort. It's doing it under nuclear threat from the north, heavy export dependence, and a long history of asymmetric negotiation with Washington. If Seoul can say, we're not able to pay $350 billion in cash, and hold its position, then so can others when faced with unrealistic demands. Not by grand speeches, but by structuring deals as co-investments, not tributes, using time to dilute pressure, leaning on law and existing agreements, and backing it all with domestic industrial strength. This is what post-obedience looks like in practice. Not shouting no from the rooftops, but quietly refusing to surrender your balance sheet. Now here's the blueprint: how to survive a tariff empire. Trump's trade philosophy has always been simple: tariffs are weapons. Trade deficits are proof of unfairness. If you want relief, you pay, literally. South Korea's answer is more complex and more useful for others. Diversify your defenses. Don't rely only on treaty promises. Build your own capabilities so you're not negotiating from fear. Turn tribute into portfolios. If you have to promise big numbers, break them into loans, guarantees, equity, with conditions. Anchor yourself in law. Use existing agreements as shields. Honor them, and insist others do the same. Use state tools unapologetically. Export financing, subsidies, industrial policy, these aren't luxuries. They're armor. Separate alliance from obedience. Security cooperation doesn't have to mean economic surrender. South Korea didn't bring down the alliance, but it did something more subversive and more interesting. It proved that even one of America's most vulnerable allies can push back on economic coercion without walking away from the security umbrella. That's the Seoul countermove. And for a world staring at new tariff wars and upfront demands, it might be the most important move of all. If you don't just want headlines, but want to understand the playbooks countries are using to stay sovereign inside someone else's system, hit subscribe. This is Liberation Lens, and perspective has never mattered more.